Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to today's Irish Landscape Institute webinar. Today's speaker is Sally O'Halloran, who has been involved in horticulture and landscape management for over 30 years in a career that has seen her gain experience from National Botanic Gardens Glasnevin, Longwood Gardens in America, RHS Wisley, and managerial experience in Kilkenny Castle Park, Emo Court, and Heywood Gardens in Laois, in public gardens worldwide, and most recently in higher education in the Norwegian University of Life Sciences in Norway. Sally trained and worked in the Sheffield School, and her teaching and research focuses on plants used by landscape professionals in urban and rural landscapes and how they can be used to develop resilient and high impact planting designs. And Sally is going to give us a talk today on the subject of turning the grey to green, plant-driven design in Sheffield. So just if everyone could keep their microphone on mute, and if you have any questions, you could put them into the chat and I'll ask them to Sally at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming during your lunch break. It's really nice that you're interested in this topic. Yeah, I'm not sure if a lot of you have heard of the grey to green, but it's this big stormwater management project in the UK in Sheffield. And I thought a lot of you now in your jobs, this is one of the big things, SuDS, rain gardens, stormwater management, and actually Sheffield is probably somewhere that's easy to visit. When I was a student, it was Seattle, it was like Oregon was the big place. Whereas it's really useful now that we have somewhere nearby to visit. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Sheffield. Before I moved there, is someone talking? Sorry. Before I moved there, the only thing I knew about it was things like the Full Monty, the film, because it was this steel city that then, of course, went into recession. But actually, I suppose I hadn't thought about the fact that the reason it was famous and was the Steel City was because of the rivers. So when you visit there, there are these kind of 5 major rivers coming into the city. And of course, when you have rivers in city, there are points as well in the city where these rivers come together. So in this particular case, it's the River Sheaf and the River Don. And I moved there in 2006, and in 2007 was the first big flood. So up until then, you know, the rivers, there had been kind of some problems in the past, but of course now with urbanization and so much, you know, kind of hard surface in cities, the chances of flooding are more common. So this big flood triggered Sheffield City Council to think about, you know, how are we going to deal with this in the future? And then the other thing that was happening at the same time was this kind of change in layout of the roads. So historically, you would have had traffic going through cities, whereas of course now we want, you know, cities to be more pedestrianized. So what you'd call the ring road that was going through the city, they decided to shift it further out. So then they ended up with this road that would have had like 4 lanes and then came down to 2. So what they decided to do then was to kind of rethink this. So on the picture here, it's where the red dot is where I'm going to sort of talk about. And it's this kind of area of the street which sort of moves along to the river, where they decided to think about stormwater management. So at the time, and you know, this is 2000 and kind of 12, we'll say, when they actually started to kind of think about these discussions. Zac Tudor was the landscape architect in Sheffield City Council. He subsequently has moved and he's now with Arup, and actually he's somebody who would be really good to do a lunchtime talk as well if you could get him, because you know he is this really energetic and passionate about plants and passionate about, you know, doing really exciting things in the city. And actually Sheffield is in northern England and it is a poor city. So it was really great that you had somebody in the council who wanted to sort of be more adventurous and be more kind of ambitious with not a lot of money actually at the time. And then he had studied at the University of Sheffield, so he knew Nigel Dunnett. And in 2015, Nigel Dunnett had done kind of the first rain garden, rain bed, which was the John Lewis head office in London. It's kind of hard to imagine now that we didn't have stormwater management everywhere in 2015. But this kind of project was really sort of like took so much work and so much effort because they were so worried, kind of the engineers, about like flooding and how it would work. So this gave Nigel a good taste of, even though it was something very small, of how you might approach stormwater management. Also, James Hitchmo was the other person in the department. Sorry, James, this is probably the worst picture you want of you that I'm going to put on YouTube now. But he was passionate about, naturalistic planting, but also he was doing all these trials. So this is in Green Estate. This PhD student, Mike Livingston, was looking at growing plants in different gravel mulches. So both of them were kind of working behind the scenes with all this stuff. And of course, then the big thing they did together was the Olympic Park. And that had got the public, sort of more aware of how planting can be more wild, more naturalistic, but also kind of management of water can also be more kind of vegetated. So the project was divided into 3 phases. And actually at the time, this was funded through the EU. So of course, by the time it's now got to phase 3, that has been quite a challenge with Brexit. However, phase 1 was EU funded. So what they were deciding was, that they did want to do this more ambitious stormwater management, and actually they would stagger it over a number of years. So sort of 2016 all the way up to 2024. It's still kind of ongoing now. So I think for those of you who are listening today who are working with SuDS, the big difference when Zac and Nigel and James and the various people got together was the word function, which is what you think of with stormwater management. And especially, I think, if you're working in these multidisciplinary projects with engineers, where they are going to emphasize all the time the function of this. The difference in this project was they started to use words like beautiful, ecological value, and then recreational value. So they saw stormwater management like, how you would see other projects that you might design, like a park, like a plaza, like other spaces. They didn't see it as purely functional. Because if you think about it, if stormwater management is purely functional, it can just be a drain, an open drain with nothing in it that just moves water slowly. So you have to see it as part of the green infrastructure and actually how valuable it can be then to a city. So Nigel was teaching in the university, still is actually at the time. So he made it a student project, which was really nice. So the visual on the left was kind of one of the visualizations that, they would have come up with. And it was a very different way of thinking. If you look at the picture, there's people in it, there's birds. The street, it isn't about the planting just kind of down the side of the street, with the building. It was sort of this ambition to kind of have planting on both sides that you'd sort of walk down between it. And then I think the other big thing was because James, Nigel, Zac have this very, very strong knowledge of plants, they were very much aware that actually calling SuDS rain beds and rain garden and stormwater management is probably the worst name that you could have given this type of planting and this kind of installation, because actually most of the time it's dry. So you're sort of planning for this movement of water, these floods, sometimes every 100 years. And okay, you're going to have big downpours of rain. But actually, a lot of the time when they're designed, for the water to kind of go into them and slow it down, but actually a lot of the time it's moving. So you'll see in that slide, it says drought tolerant planting. And I think this is the one big thing that all of you, any of you who are working with stormwater management now, it is that these systems are a lot drier than you think. So putting in wetland plants and water loving plants, a lot of the time is not going to work. So this was the system. The water is coming down off the path, off the various buildings, and sort of coming down into this dip. And there are all these channels and these kind of check dams. And actually what I'll do is I'll show you a picture of what that looks like, kind of the reality of it when it's getting made. Because parts of this first phase are on a flat site, the picture on the left, and then it goes down a hill. So when it's going down the hill, you have all these kind of check dams to slow it down. And also these kind of various levels, it becomes like a terrace. It becomes like what you might do in a garden or on any slope, that you sort of then have these microclimates in these various spaces. So the other thing to think about is the soil. And yeah, I lived in Sheffield and now I've moved to Norway. And I see in Oslo, especially, you know, there's loads and loads of rain gardens going in. And what I'm noticing is that the soil is this kind of rich loam where they're being designed with this soil like you would put in, you know, at what we'd call a flower bed. Whereas actually the soil in the grey to green is, you know, more like the type of medium that you'd use for a green roof. And this is coming again from Nigel Dunnett had set up this green roof forum in Sheffield, and a lot of his earlier research was with this kind of free draining, lighter materials. So if you look at that, and you can, you know, watch this later at a kind of slower pace, 80% of what's in this grey to green is a very free draining, sandy, stony medium. And then there's only 20% where it is kind of soil with some nutrients, because it's not about rich sort of, you know, kind of fertilized planting. It is about much more kind of tougher conditions, and especially those of you who are putting these structures into the city. So the other thing is it's, you know, all of these layers went in and you can see it, you know, it's at this sort of big scale. But then the final thing was the phase one of this also put a mulch layer, this kind of layer of stone. And what I'm going to do is show you what they learned from phase one and how they did phase two slightly different. But phase one, they were thinking about water loss. So of course, any mulch kind of holds in water, but also weeds. You know, we're in a city that doesn't have a lot of money. So you are trying to think of how you can make this low maintenance. So you've got this structure that has this very free draining medium. And then the next thing was, you know, what kind of planting would you put in? And of course, the Sheffield School has become famous for naturalistic planting. So it was never going to be block planting maybe, or, you know, sort of mass planting of one thing. And, you know, the principles behind naturalistic planting is that you are kind of looking to the wild and you're looking at the patterns and the way plants are arranged in the wild. So it is kind of, it's about layers. It's about, you know, having kind of shade tolerant plants. But also, I suppose the big thing with it is it's about succession, and it's about this kind of trickle of interest coming all the time, which is really important when you're in a city where you've got people walking past the same planting all the time. I mean, it's really important in your garden as well, anywhere where you're kind of looking at the same thing, but also in terms of early pollinators, having this diversity, it's really, really important. And another place, for those of you maybe who aren't doing mixes, Sheffield is famous, but all of this ideas originated in Germany. So Hermannshof, this famous garden where Richard Hansen sort of developed these ideas, and Steele. And now Cassian Smith was the director there, and there's a lot of lectures on YouTube that he's given, because it's also about just basically putting plants together that are from a similar habitat. So it's not about, you know, picking up plants in the wild and recreating it exactly. This sort of naturalistic approach is sort of looking at plants that like the same conditions and putting them together in a more naturalistic way. This picture isn't showing that very clearly because when you go to Hermanshof, it is a teaching garden, so everything is labelled, and some of the plantings are maybe more block-like, but others are more naturalistic. So this was the approach. It was going to be plants that at the sides of the swale would be very dry, and then maybe in the dip, they would be a little bit wetter. So when they made the planting plan, and I know you can't see this clearly, but there were two mixes, so dry and wet, kind of more moist. And then when you're making these mixes, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on how to make a mix, but I suppose just to be aware that it is about putting plants together that are they like the same conditions. And then you've got to think about them in layers. So there's always like a ground layer that kind of comes up early and then kind of goes quiet for the rest of the year and tolerates shade. Then there's this kind of taller layer that has loads of seasonal interest. And then there's the very tall layer, and I'm only talking about perennials here, that you kind of have the lowest percentage of, which kind of gives a bit of the wow factor. But you will also have trees and shrubs with this. But again, the main thing is it's not all about flowers. When you start putting plants together in mixes, you're thinking about leaves and covering the ground. The main thing is that, you know, you're thinking about that ground being covered a lot of the year so that people won't have to weed and that it'll be more ecologically strong. So in terms of doing mixes, you know, it's all about thinking in percentages. And I've used Nigel Dunnett's book here because he is one of the key designers in the Grey to Green. But Thomas Rayner and Claudia West will have a formula in their book, Sarah Price, Noel Kingsbury and Pete Odoff. They're all saying the same thing. It's just they're using different vocabulary. So where most of them call it ground cover for the low layer, Nigel will call it satellite, whereas Thomas Rayner will call it seasonal. The anchor plants might be called the emergent plants. And when you're making your mixes, you can call them whatever you want. The main thing is that you are thinking about them in this kind of layered community. So like I said, you're looking to the wild for inspiration. And, you know, if you follow James Hitchmo in particular, Nigel, they're always out in nature looking at plants. So when they're thinking about plant selection, you know, they're thinking about how that plant grows in the wild. So, you know, something like this, which is Liatris spicata, when I'm teaching the students, you know, here I'm like, you always have to look up the habitat. So it's not just that it's from Central and Eastern United States. What you want to know is in the wild, like, is it in a damp meadow? Is it in a rocky, dry, you know, mountain range? Is it in a forest? Because that's what you're then trying to kind of mimic when you put it into these man-made landscapes. So after years of traveling and looking to the wild, you know, this is where you start to become familiar with what might work well. So like one of the things in the grey to green then, for example, is Liatris spicata, because it's in these damp meadows, but it's also in these sandy, drier plantings. So if you're looking for this list of dry plants, there is a book. It's from Denver Botanic Gardens called Steppe. And Steppe is a part of the world like the cover of that picture, where it's the grassland to the kind of lower layer of the mountain. And that group of plants has proven really good for water management or for drought tolerant planting because they're able to cope with dry, but then you also have these kind of wetter periods that they can cope with. So on that planting plan for phase one, that whole list is all kind of dry loving plants. And then they're put together in these mixes where they all have different roles. So one of the other things is when you're trying to get the public on board with this, especially in the first few years, if you're planting in really small plants, you have this group called short-lived. And Verbena bonariensis has kind of proven to be the one that everyone uses, because in that very first year, it just flowers really well. But now if you go to Sheffield, there's no sign of it. It only lasts for kind of the first 5 years, less, and then it's gone, and all the other plants have got bigger. And then you've got this seasonal layer, and ideally what you want from the seasonal layer is that they have more than one season. So things like Rudbeckia will also have a really nice winter seed head, and the same with asters. So you're not just kind of thinking, flowers. You're thinking, what do those leaves look like in the spring? What does it look like in autumn or winter? Like if you can get plants with 3 seasons of interest, it's really, really good and really, really good value then. So the other side then was the dip. So that was the dry list, and then this was the swale list. And again, I know you probably all want this kind of magic list now for rain gardens, but it's all trial and error, and there are very few books. So this book was produced a few years ago, and that does have a list at the back, which is quite useful. And then, of course, you can look at this list, which is the list that they used. And then this was done in the sort of the downhill bit. So you can see, like Lythrum salicaria, that is a sort of really good native plant that you'd see in kind of wetlands. But then they have actually used a cultivar of it just to make it, a bit more exciting. And you work down the layers, things like lichness. And the joy of using it in a mix is that you can have things like iris. If you use iris in block planting, you might get a 3 weeks interest from it. Okay, you might get the seed heads as well. But when you're in these mixes, it means that something else will take over when you stop flowering. And that's why this is so dynamic and so exciting. So that was in the kind of 2018. I just want to sort of show you, how this has developed. So this has not been watered, it's in this kind of dry, apart from natural rainfall. But if you look at it now, these plants, because they're in the right conditions and they're happy together, they have completely thrived. And actually, the thing with this system is some of them are going to take over. So, that big long list now is much smaller because things have been lost, but they haven't left a gap. They have sort of naturally died and something has taken their place. So there aren't kind of big holes everywhere. And I suppose the other thing then to be aware of is that, it was a Pete Odoff quote, not a sort of Sheffield quote. This brown is also a colour. So this does not get cut back until the spring. I was there last week. It hadn't been cut back yet because they're short-staffed. That's things you can ask me about later. But it's also that this is there in the winter and getting the public used to potentially what people use the word messy, which I don't want to use. It is this stronger ecological system, but it's getting people used to that. And then the ornamental grasses in phase 1, because this kind of wilder aesthetic was kind of unusual for people, Nigel did put this kind of drift of Calamagrostis, Carl Forster, all the way through it. He called it a chain because it was this linear route on the flat part so that people would see structure. So that if you weren't used to this wilder aesthetic, actually your eye could sort of zoom in to some structure. And then the trees were done by Zac Tudor because he'd already been working in the city with trees and he had already used things like Quercus palustris in the city, but he wanted to try other trees. So things like Cercis siliquastrum, which you have the flowers and the seed pods, because the thing with this system is you don't want to create a lot of leaf litter. You need it to stay dry and that gravel mulch, because once leaves and things start falling, they turn into soil and create kind of scope for weeds. So the trees do ideally need to be trees with kind of smaller leaves, or you have a system in place where when things get cut back, everything gets cleaned, or they come through with a leaf blower to sort of get rid of the leaves. Because the other thing then is shrubs. And in phase one, they used evergreen shrubs. They were thinking like Mediterranean, sun-loving, drought-tolerant. So all the shrubs that went in were kind of evergreen, tougher sort of shrubs for a planting that was not going to get watered. So if you look at it now, you know, in 2023, the shrubs have completely, the ones that are happy, Phlomis, fruticosa, they have taken up the space of maybe what would have been the sort of more temporary perennials or the more sort of perennials that have just kind of now kind of died out. And the same rosemary, although I thought I changed the name. It's not called rosemary anymore. It's salvia, rosemarinifolia. That's another one that has really thrived really well. And then, you know, again, seeing it in December, that those evergreen shrubs are really, really good. And then the other thing, which of course on most projects is seen as an additional expense, are bulbs. And of course, we don't think of stormwater management as having bulbs. But you know, one of the things you have to think about is when it does get cut back. And this was it now last weekend, where everything has just been cut back. So potentially you're left with kind of, you know, this gap where nothing is happening for a few weeks. So one of the things you do is you pick perennials, like I said, with really interesting foliage, or you pick perennials that flower really early. So Primula veris is a real winner, or things like Euphorbia. It was Polychroma, it's changed name, you know, where they come out early and then they go quiet for the rest of the summer. But mainly it is these bulbs. And actually a lot of the bulbs, you know, it's not necessarily Galanthus and Crocus. It is these bulbs that sort of flower later that have this vertical element. So they're adding height while you're waiting for the perennials to grow. So things like alliums, while you're sort of waiting for everything, they're giving you color. So it's this dynamic system. Okay, and then phase two, I just want to sort of show what they learned. So phase one cost 3.6 million. It was that kind of flat road and then came down. And then this next phase two cost more because it was much more complicated, okay? It's sort of coming down it's adjacent to the river. And oh, sorry, I'm on two screens and I don't know how to get the thing to go over to the other side. Oh, here we go. It's along by the river, and then it's kind of coming down a road that actually is going to have both traffic and pedestrians on it. So, you know, if you see the kind of visualization, this was going to be much more complicated because the last one was just a building, the public and planting on both sides. But now there's like cycle routes, car routes, river, existing kind of conditions. So they use though the same system, these interconnecting swales, and then they use the exact same soil because that had worked really well. But Zac, you know, or one of them, I think it was maybe Zac, decided, can we try it without the layer of gravel mulch? Because this is an additional expense. So, you know, this is the thing with the grey to green, and this is why it's so good, is that they're taking risks and they're experimenting. And I know it's probably hard for all of you to do that in offices and jobs. And that's why it's useful to hook up with a university where you're sort of saying it's part of this experiment, because it's all trial and error. This is the only way we're going to learn. I know you can't see this. I didn't want to put the plan on, but the previous plan was just 2 mixes. This was 5. So they had learned from the first one, you know, gained confidence and became way more ambitious with what this was going to look like. So Zac did the trees again, and trees from North America, especially trees from swamps and from compact ground, were proving really good in the city. So liquid amber, Styraciflua, Quercus palustris. So then Zac wanted to try things like Nyssa sylvatica, which you don't really see that often, and then putting in some native trees as well. I'm sure people are going to ask me about the native, non-native discussion here. So there is, you know, they have used some native plants where they are appropriate. And then the other thing was the trees had to go in a bit bigger because they're now really important for boundaries, for direction. So the good thing is they've sort of, learned which ones work and then sort of have the confidence because of course the trees are the most expensive, part of this planting, and chosen ones that have worked really well. The other thing then was they sort of thought, why are we just using evergreen shrubs? Yes, they're great for, drought and winter interest, but actually not all of this planting in this area is going to be dry all the time. And there is some shade. So they've decided to put in deciduous shrubs, and also they decided to put them in bigger. So I think with shrubs like the 3 litre pot, was fine. But actually, again, in this area where you're going to have a lot of traffic, people potentially walking through the planting, having them bigger, is easier, also easier for maintenance because they won't be touched. The bigger the shrub, the less likely the contractor is going to start pruning it. So things like Aronia, Amelanchier, where they have Amelanchier flowers, nice green leaves in the summer, but then really good autumn color. So you're finding these deciduous shrubs that have multiple seasons of interest. Excuse me, of interest. I do just need to take a drink. And then that was it last December, where you can see, it's 3 years old, less, 2.5 years, and looks so established already. And then it is mixes, okay? And then I'm aware now that you want to ask questions. So what I've done is I've just kind of put all the mixes, and I'm going to go through them really quickly just so that you will have this as a record. I mean, this is very complicated. And if you go to other cities, Amsterdam, Ton Muller is an amazing plantsman, Giacomo Guzan in London, they are using matrices because these mixes to make them is so complicated, but also, kind of the sort of upkeep of them, they find that the matrix is easier. Sheffield is different because it has all this experience and it has people who know how to maintain this. So yeah, instead of 2, there's 5, and they dropped the density. It was 15, which was very high, but they wanted instant impact. They've realized that 12 and actually potentially 9 is okay because these plants are happy and they will grow. So, this is kind of the level of the sort of plant expertise. Short, pink, blue, silver, and orange. And then you look at it, and that's exactly what it says on the tin. Really nice with this mix of bulbs, perennials. Then you'll have another mix that's medium height, yellow, blue, and red. And you can see, it's just that little bit taller. Then they had a mix that actually had a lot of grasses and sedges in it. So where they had put the Calamagrostis in phase 1, Nigel had put it in this kind of drift. Now they've made these mixes that are more grass heavy. So if you look at it sort of through the seasons, you've got the Primula veris in May, and then the grasses, I've skipped a season, are getting bigger and bigger. So you've got Calamagrostis Carl Forster, Calamagrostis brachytricha, Carex, you've got much more. It has a very different feel to it. So these mixes are very, very specialist. And then this really tall mix with all the sort of tallest plants kind of coming through. Okay. And then the gray to green phase 2 was in shade. So they did actually in phase 1, they didn't have shade. So actually here they did. So that was quite nice to have a go with the sort of more shady mix, which is probably a lot of the conditions, that people are dealing with. Okay, so like I said, this is complex planting design, which some of you might be watching thinking, oh my God, how would you ever sort of get the money or come up with all of this? I will argue that when I'm teaching, because the mixes are sort of like this mathematic formula where you are kind of going, what's your ground cover, what's your seasonal? I do find the students find that easier than block planting, where you've got to really think about that block. And if it's interesting, what's beside it, what will happen when it disappears, if it dies down in the winter, that the mix formula, if you like maths, the mix formula works really well. But the other thing, of course, is that, you know, Sheffield was then proposing this type of, you know, planting that the kind of standard maintenance, the standard teaching of horticultural training isn't teaching, you know, how you look after this. Because in the standard system, which, you know, I worked in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin, I trained as a gardener, you know, you did an action, you know, you cut something back, the action was done, you saw the result. Whereas in these dynamic systems, when you start doing something to one plant, it's kind of impacting the other. So it's evolving, it's dynamic. You really have to understand, like, how much space do you want this plant to take up? And it's this dynamic process. And you really have to sort of understand that. So Sheffield was able to do this because there's this amazing social enterprise called Green Estate. And again, you know, it'd be really good for you all to go on if you could have some sort of, you know, day or 2 days away to sort of go to Sheffield, but also go to Green Estate, where it is this group of people. A lot of them actually have been trained in the University of Sheffield, who are now doing all of this kind of planting all over the UK. So they're actually installing it, but also they're doing the maintenance. So this should have gone, of course, you know, to a sort of, it did go out to tender. So Green Estate managed it the first few years, and then it went back to the company in Sheffield who are called Amy, who do all the work. I'm sure you've heard all the scandal with the trees and a few problems before. But they turned around and said, we cannot manage this. This is just something we don't know. So then they subcontracted to Green Estate. So, of course, for all of you, you know, if you do this, you have to think about maintenance. And I was back there last weekend, and of course, the UK is in this, you know, times of austerity now. And, you know, Sheffield never had money. So actually, even now, it's kind of, you know, tougher. And phase three has started. So phase three has this, they're calling it the Dutch roundabout. So it's where all this cycling will be going around. And it's continuing up the hill all the way up to the university. So it has been planted. But you know, I don't know whether this is going to come through on the picture, but it was full of litter. Because of course the challenge with this water management system is the dip, that like the wind blows all the trash into it, all the litter into it. So Green Estate are subcontracted to do the planting and look after the planting, but they are not subcontracted to pick litter every day. And you know, it's these, what we talk about, these cues for care, that actually, you know, this is one of the things you have to think about is these systems will attract litter that actually someone, you know, will have to kind of manage that if it's not part of the kind of green space maintenance. However, I'm at a point now where it doesn't bother me. Like, you know, somebody will come in a few weeks, they'll get some volunteers, it'll be gone. The important thing is that there now is these kind of green streets, this water management in this huge expanse through the city. In times of austerity, they are still pushing for planting, and it's planting first. And it's this plant-driven design that actually is making people's lives better as they walk past it, because it is so uplifting and does really kind of lift your spirit every day. Okay, so I've put, when you Google the Greater Green, there are so many resources online. Nigel Dunnett in particular, his website, he talks in detail about it. But Sheffield City Council has really talked about it, Sustran, the people who've done kind of the engineering. So there are loads and loads of resources. I'm just sort of giving you a teaser, let's say, today for it. Okay, that was very fast, but I'm hoping you'll just rewatch the recording and have it for the future. Yeah, so
Thanks so much,
questions?
Sally. If you want to get a drink of water there before we
Thank you.
throw
Yeah,
more
I'm good.
stuff at you, that'll give me an opportunity to advertise our next webinar, which will be this same time, same day next week with Lorraine Bull, which will be on ecological corridors. And if you have any questions for Sally, you can just pop them into the chat, or if you want to, you can turn on your camera and ask them yourselves. So, as Sally was saying, there's a lot of information in there, and anyone coming in late as well, the video will be uploaded to the ILI YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so we'll be able to go back over it and give ourselves a recap because there's an awful lot of information in there. Sally, it seems that it was very much plant-driven project and strikes me as a bit different from here. These projects are generally driven by water management primarily, and we'd um, refer, or certainly our brothers and sisters in engineering would refer to the SuDS, the UK SuDS manual, and that would be very specific on the soil mixes. So I suppose we find ourselves getting a specified soil mix and trying to get the plants then to match that rather than the other way around, which seems to happen in Sheffield. But I was wondering about the sign off then. Was there any difficulties departing from the
Yeah,
as
absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, Nigel, that I don't know if you can see me or if it's just the slide that says questions. Can you see my face or is it just the slide that says
yeah,
questions?
I can see your face as
Okay,
well.
fine. That's
Yeah.
okay. I'm not that vain, but it's easier if I'm visible. Yeah, so the John Lewis, this John Lewis, if any of you are in London, it's absolutely tiny, that first one that he did. And it almost put him off doing it because it took so many meetings and so much kind of consultation. And so that then actually when he sort of was doing it in Sheffield, he knew that was going to happen. The grey to green phase one is over engineered. Like it really is. And they kind of accept that the engineers wanted, like to be sure that it would tackle this flood. But like one of the things, was that the public actually, sorry, I'm kind of answering this in a very roundabout way. The public were really disappointed that they couldn't see water because you have all this stormwater management, but it was because, of course, the engineering was all about moving the water and getting it out of there and slowing it down. But no, I mean, you're dealing with people who are very, very confident, James and Nigel, and had this years of expertise with them that the council trusted them.
Mm.
And I think that's the challenge for any of you out there who are like a young landscape architect, and even if you're not that young, if you don't have loads of these projects. So that's why, of course, you have to have this manual that's telling you exactly. But I mean, I think the only thing with any project is having these case studies and saying, look, they've done it, and getting kind of people like Zac to talk, to sort of say, this is how you get around it, and just having this confidence. And I think this is one of the hard things I have teaching landscape architect students is they're really nice. Like you need to have the confidence of architects. And that's a really bold statement, but you need to have these arguments and you need to be able to say, actually, this is a better way of doing it. We have to try, because otherwise, like, why are you in the profession if you are going to be kind of always in the shadow of the engineer, the architect? Like, you have to sort of say, this will be so much better if it's done, this way. Yeah.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to get one more of my own questions before I give it everyone else's. Did you measure the outcomes in terms of water quality and quantity, and were they favorable?
I don't know.
You don't
That's
know, yeah.
something
I
now. I
know
don't
it's a
know that's
planting
a
talk,
very,
but
yes, it's a planting talk. There is Nigel's website though, has all the, and I mean, I've put too much in. I know that was very fast, but he does have all the measurements about like what the flood they were dealing with. All of that is on his website. And I did have it in, but I had to start deleting stuff. Yeah, that you
right.
can actually look up that and actually, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Maybe
There's
you'll get Zac to give a talk as well with the layer of like really technical information.
yeah. Um everyone is saying what a great presentation you've given us and thanking you. So I'm not going to read
Oh,
out each and every one of them or we won't get the questions in. So Julia would like to know, what do you consider the main mistakes in rain garden and swale design generally?
yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Norway. I won't start slating Ireland. Okay. So in Norway at the moment, when I walk around and look at rain gardens, It's block planting. It's Calamagrostis Carl Forster, which is actually great, especially in the Norwegian climate. It's standing through the winter, and Lythrum salicaria. But then it is just, we'll say 3 other random perennials. It's like I can't see any planting strategy, and I can't see that anyone thought like echinacea, for example, or, plants where I'm thinking actually anemone, because they're using really rich soil here and they are watering rain gardens here, which is slightly insane. However, I've come from such an ecological system, so the first thing is that they're sort of misinterpreting what it's about. Like, you should actually water when the plants maybe go in the first year, but then you should not water again. These plants should be tough. They should be from drier conditions. And ideally, okay, a mix is very complicated. And I'm not sure if you all know what a matrix is, but a matrix is like fruit cake, where you have the dough. So it'll be something like Ceslaria autumnalis or a Carex, and then you will have plants kind of dotted in it. So it's less complicated. But actually it's basically having plants that are suited to the actual conditions and not using the same plants that you might use in every other planting in the city. The conditions are very, very different. Yeah.
Yeah. And one from Aldona then, which is what percentage of native planting is recommended?
Yeah, so in the UK, so that was done it's amazing how things have changed. So like the 2015, there wasn't a mention of a native plant. To 2024, Sheffield City Council now, it depends on, the project, but because that was set up as experimental to begin with, it hasn't had those same guidelines. Also, it's going up, the last phase is going up a hill in a really urban area between the sort of buildings. So they're not maybe worried about invasive plants. But I know there's projects in London now where they're talking 50% plants, 50% native, that they are pushing it. So I have a PhD student now here who's looking at native plants for rain gardens. Because the other thing is, like, if you were to say Irish native plants, what are you going to put into a rain garden? Iris pseudochorus, Lythrum salicaria, what else? Like, what, Philipendula? But these are all water loving plants that, so what you need to do is go to the coast and go to the sort of drier parts, almost even the Burren, and sort of find a group of plants that can cope with this. And that's what my PhD student is doing here now, is he's out looking at nature types and sort of trying to match the nature type with the rain garden. So, I mean, the Sheffield School, when I was teaching, we were teaching about ecological design, and within that, it's right plant, right place. And if it's a native plant, absolutely. But we are going to cause more damage if we start taking native plants out of the wild, collecting seed and bringing them into cities and putting them in the wrong place, and then they die. Like, that's not what this is about. Plus, the conditions in the city are so tough. There's so much hotter, windier, climate change. You really have to kind of match the right plant to the right place. It's not just this formula where you say, put in 50%. So, I mean, what is the percentage in Ireland then? What percentage of native plants are people being encouraged to use?
That would vary. So it's generally set out in the local development plan, so it change depending on which local authority you're in. But I think it would most objectives would be vague enough that they would favor local, rather than give an actual percentage.
Yeah.
And it's generally done, I suppose, by negotiation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. And I'm
yeah.
completely, gosh, if it's a good plant and actually you're going to put it in and it's going to thrive, absolutely, of course we should use it. But it's putting these poor plants in that are like, I see Luzula sylvatica everywhere in Norway in full sun, in rain gardens. It's a woodland, half shade, shade. Like, this is
Mm,
not what we're about. We have skills, we have knowledge. We're not taking things and putting them into the wrong conditions.
yes. And I guess that goes beyond rain gardens or swales as well.
Yeah, that's a bigger conversation,
Yeah.
yes.
So question from Mike then, and this might fall into the technical category, but in fine tuning with the local authority on health and safety, did you have to agree to a maximum depth to which the swales wouldn't exceed?
Yeah, this is why you need to get Zac. You know, I've only involved in like, you know, teaching about the planting, and I was never at any of those meetings with the council where they were like discussing all of the engineering of it. I think Nigel's website does have a lot of detail in it, but most of that engineering, it probably is worth getting Zac to go through. It probably would be quite a good workshop to do with him, how you get around all of this. Yeah. Plus, I think again, because it was the early days, you know, I'm wondering now, like I was back in Sheffield in the city centre, they've taken up the equivalent of Grafton Street and put water management the whole way down the centre of it. And that hasn't been Zac because he's left the council, it's someone else. So I'm wondering now if they potentially do have this manual themselves that they are now kind of working with. I'm not sure. I should actually, when I came back last weekend, I thought I must contact the council to see who's doing all the bit now down the city. Yeah.
Right. Studio Glassu then and Digby Brady Landscape Architects would both like to know, do you know what the annual maintenance costs are?
Oh, does anyone give away the cost? I can tell you what it, yeah, I mean, this is my greatest challenge in teaching is, you know, I've been trying to get students to do thesis, dissertations here. Of course, no contractor is going to tell you how much things cost.
Yep.
However, the Green Estate is great because they will tell us. Basically, it's 12 visits a year that they were given. So that's like basically it's up to them whether they do one a month. It's nothing. It's so little. And then Sheffield City Council hasn't, this is something now that was, actually I won't say this because it's getting recorded, but there's been trouble with play payment because there is, but it's very little maintenance. So actually, if you go there, there are weeds, you know, because what's happening is they do the cutback. So the whole thing is cut back now, kind of February, March, and they sort of blow away, you know, any of the sort of leaves. And then they're only able to go back, you know, kind of the rest of the year and just maybe tackle if there are any difficult perennial weeds. But if you go there, there are weeds because the public can't tell the difference. And you've got to get your head into this ecological design where it is much more about accepting that there will be some weeds, but then it's that tipping point where, of course, you need people to know at what point is that going to be a problem. So the maintenance should ideally be more. The public do email the council and say, why aren't you watering? Because they're not watering. They are letting things wilt and then recover. So the public do have this forum to complain. They've put loads of signs up now. So really nice signage that says this is ecological design, this is water management, because you have to teach the public about this. I listened to a really good lunchtime lecture actually, and this is someone you should get, is Mark Barrow in Paris, because Paris is going through this huge, amazing reinventing of itself with all this renaturing. If you Google renaturing Mark Barrow, you'll get his PDF. And it is part of the strategy is the public. And it's teaching all the professionals and those who are doing maintenance about this wilder aesthetic, but it's also the public. Because of course it's these cities that are used to annual plants, you know, annual bedding. So you just have to accept that actually those days are gone. There isn't money for that. And that you have to kind of get on board with this slightly wilder look, although it is this horticultural ecology with the grey to green, they do know how to manage it.
Right.
Yeah,
Um, so Viola says that in reality, landscape contractors seem to struggle with naturalistic planting
yeah.
mixes. Any suggestions how to specify the planting so it's easier to understand for any landscaping contractor?
Yeah, I mean, you know, James Hitchmo takes photographs of like weeds and the seedlings, and you know, I don't know if you have seen his book Sowing Beauty. Yeah, you know, that book is really good. Even though it's seed mixes, he talks through all the challenges, you know, of the maintenance. I mean, the thing is, and I know you're all going to laugh, But it's just as landscape architects, it's that going back once a year with the contractor. And of course, like if you become famous like Pete Odoff, you know, he will get paid in his projects to go back all the time. It's really bad that we have this disconnect, that the designer walks away and then this contractor is trying to imagine, you know, what's going on. But SLA in Copenhagen, now that big Danish firm, they're producing all these management plans that are much more visual. Okay, so I think these technical documents, you know, cut back this, da 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 da, they're useful, but actually what people need are the pictures, where it is much more like, this is how I see it, you know, that this is going to kind of ultimately disappear in 3 years. But I mean, the main thing is it's like cut back once a year is the biggest job, and then don't water. It's kind of trying to teach people to do less. And that's, I've spoken to the contractors here and they're like, oh, but you know, there's too many plants, you know, and again, it's getting used to not seeing soil, which of course there was a load of us brought up with that teaching. And it is just getting your eye into how you want it to look. And that
Right.
then trying to communicate that.
I have two more questions, Sally,
Okay,
and
go on. I need to be more succinct.
two
Yeah.
minutes, 2 minutes to answer them. So
Yeah.
I'm going to throw them both at you at the same time, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Aidan is commenting on the, I suppose, the tug of war between engineers, civil engineers, and landscape architects in the design of SuDS.
Yeah.
And from your perspective from Norway and the UK, has it landscape architects or plant-driven design, how has that come to the fore
Yeah.
compared to
So
Ireland? And if I could throw the
Norway's,
second one in
yeah, go
as
on.
well, is Andre would like to know, was seeding considered in the mixes?
Okay, that seeding is easy because the problem with seeding is it takes so long. So seeding wasn't an option, especially for phase one. Like you would just have had to wait so long. So James's book Sowing Beauty, it does talk about how long it takes when you're seeding. Seeding is fine for like an annual meadow or some of these perennial meadows, but for rain gardens, you would really have to have fences up, you know, manage it. So I know ultimately it's cheaper, but actually it's not long term. So no, that wasn't an option. And then look, landscape architects, you just need to be more aggressive. You just need to have these arguments. Norway is the same as Ireland. Norway has this whole thing about you can't be vain, you can't be impose on anyone, you know, like how we were brought up in Ireland. So of course they won't have these arguments. I think we need the confidence of Americans, of the British, you know, that will have these arguments. Like we have to sort of, you know, like you just have to kind of channel this, what we would call arrogance, and just have these arguments or drag someone, get the money to drag the Zac Tudors and the people who have done it to try and get them into these conversations. Because all you need is one success story in Ireland. You just need one, because that's the thing, is the grey to green now has allowed the rest of the landscape architect practices in the UK to kind of go, we can do it. You just need some project to get funded that will be more ambitious and have the confidence and take these risks. And then that can be used, you know, as the template. The end.
The end. Sally, thank you so much. So much.
Okay.
There's so much in that. You've given us so much to go on, and hopefully you will be back in the hot seat again in the
Yeah.
future.
Oh, God, yeah.
So thanks a million to Sally on behalf
No
of everyone,
problem. And
and
thanks for
thanks.
inviting me.
It was absolute pleasure, and thank you to Hazel and Christos as well for organizing today. Yeah, it's absolute pleasure, and I wish for the afternoon now that I was going to be doing a planting plan for SuDS feature, but unfortunately it's not on the cards today.
Oh, I recognize some of the
Inspirational.
names. It's nice to see people. I've been out of Ireland so long. It's lovely to see names I recognize. Okay. Yeah. Well done, everyone. Go forth and do good planting.
Thanks. Bye bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.